recording. Welcome everyone to the Gulf Coast Prairie Landscape Conservation Cooperative Lunchtime Webinar Series for July 2016. Before we begin, I'm going to remind everyone listening to please mute your phones during the presentation. There will be a lot of time, and I encourage you to ask questions towards the end of the presentation. So today I'm going to provide a brief overview of Gulf Coast Prairie LCC's, our Coarse Filter landscape conservation design efforts to date, and see how that might help us as we look to submit a blueprint or a conservation blueprint to the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy blueprint for fall release. So my name is Ben Kaler. I'm the Science Coordinator for the Gulf Coast Prairie LCC. And this work would not be possible were it not for the strong direction from the GCP Steering Committee, but also the tireless effort from Blair Turpak, our Geomatics Coordinator, who over the last a little over a year has really devoted a significant amount of her time and effort into making sure products pass snuff. So thank you, Blair. So today I'm going to give us an overview of the process we've used in our Coarse Filter LCD. We're going to see some of the fruits of our labor, get the first glimpse at the Gulf Coast Prairie blueprint scenario, and have an opportunity to discuss our submission, the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy blueprint. So when we talk about landscape conservation design, just very briefly, it's both a process and a suite of products. It's a collaborative process for defining conservation goals, helping to establish targets, and describe the desired landscape conditions to support those conservation objectives. It's also combined with products that are collaboratively produced, science-based, spatially explicit products that help to designate priority areas and estimate the amount of action necessary to achieve those actions or those objectives. So it really gets at the what, where, and how much. And we do these things because our partnership wanted to achieve our vision and our mission. So a landscape of natural and cultural resources in the GCP geography that are resilient to the threats and stressors associated with land use change, with climate and land use changes. We are looking at landscape conservation design as the bridge between planning and implementation. And on the planning side, our LCC has defined how we want to achieve our mission and vision by identifying broadly defined habitats across the LCC. We have 17 broadly defined habitats listed here. And they're also tied to focal species. There are 28 focal species that our LCC has chosen that represent those habitats. So as we move into and through landscape conservation design efforts, we're primarily doing these with a focus on our broadly defined habitats and our focal species. So for the Coarse Filter, our targets are primarily these broadly defined habitats. The process we've used to date is essentially to project where our broadly defined habitats are likely to or have the potential to occur across the Gulf Coast Prairie while examining threats posed by growth of developed land and sea level rise. It's been a collaborative effort within the science team for over a year now. These products are catchment-based, and the process and the products have been entirely separate from other planning efforts, such as state wildlife action plans or the Texas Conservation Strategy. So the two main approaches that we've used for projecting these broadly defined habitats can roughly be put into two basic categories. Terrestrial broadly defined habitats, these are the ones that are largely based on land cover data and other data associated with those land cover data sets. 10 of the 12 broadly defined habitats that we've projected to date fall into this category. We roughed out a rule set and has been thoroughly vetted. So a rule set was created, debated at length, and revised many times within the science team over 2 in-person meetings and webinars, and also the many, many follow-up conversations after those. And these 10 projections are really the aggregation of habitat and areas with the potential for that habitat across the LCC, while taking into consideration the threats posed by development growth scenario and the sea level rise scenario. The other 2 approach we've taken quite recently has been for 2 of our more aquatic broadly defined habitats. So these are not land cover based, not driven by land cover so much, but they're more on the rivers, streams, and headwaters. And so in order to project those types of habitats, it's not just the aggregation of those, it's more getting more into the desired ecological conditions of those systems. And so a month and a half ago here in Lafayette, the science team met and we started drilling down into defining the desired ecological conditions for our aquatic habitats. We are still in the process of vetting these projections, but these 2 go one step further than the previous group in that we're actually getting into defining what our desired ecological state for those systems are. So here's just a few results. I'm going to kind of blow through these pretty quickly. Just for everyone's knowledge here, on each of these slides there will be 2 different broadly defined habitats projected. The name of those are at the top of each image. And as far as rankings, the dark blue is the highest rank catchment, and so the yellow are the lowest rank catchments. So if you look, as you're looking at these images, blue is better, yellow isn't as good as we'd like it to be, based on our rule sets. So on the left we have tallgrass prairie. We're also projecting semi-desert, shrub, and grassland. So as we go through these, you can get a sense of the geographic distribution of these broadly defined habitats. Freshwater non-forested wetlands and tidal wetlands. Mixed deciduous and juniper forests, primarily hill country, and oak, hardwood, and pine forest. Floodplain forests, swamps, and riparian systems. You can really see some of those larger river areas in this image. And also shrubland and shortgrass, otherwise known as mixed grass prairie. And this is a combined projection for headwaters and streams and rivers and lakes. As I mentioned before, this product is based on desired ecological conditions identified by the science team, and includes metrics for sinuosity, risk of habitat degradation from NIFHAP, stream impairment status, but is also scaled with the amount of impervious land, the amount of canopy cover, and the amount of cultivated crops within that catchment. We're also interested in the near term at also incorporating a risk of flow alteration, and we have a draft data set that was produced with the Southeast Aquatic Resources Partnership that gets at that, and we're working through getting access to that data and incorporating it into the rule set. So generally for headwaters and streams, we're looking at more braided, low risk, not impaired streams that have a low amount of impervious cover, greater amount of canopy cover across the catchment, and a low amount of cultivated crops. So which habitats did we omit? So we have 17 broadly defined habitats, and not all of them have projections. We are working through developing some of the data models behind some of these still for open-based systems, reservoirs, and possibly for agricultural lands. There are a few of these where we are hesitant given the dearth of spatial data or the quality of spatial data for these, primarily for aquifers, springs, and spring runs and caves. But these have not been incorporated into our coarse filter as of yet, but some are in the works. So the next steps for these products is to continue to create and vet the projections of aquatic broadly defined habitats within our science team, getting feedback and revisions in anticipation for GCP steering committee call on the 20th of July. We're also going to be seeking the guidance of the steering committee on the desired documentation for these products, what the final products and report should look like, and we propose that as an agenda item for that July call as well. But ultimately, we have committed ourselves to submit something to the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy Blueprint, which will be released this October. So in order to get us ready for that, we would need to vet and upload our submission to our Conservation Planning Atlas by August 30th. And this may also include opportunities to integrate our planning and LCD across the border with the Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks LCC. Okay, so what does it all mean? I've presented a bunch of different layers, and I've just talked about combining them and submitting them. And so what I'd like to do is present, for the first time, a look at a draft blueprint version 0.1. So what you see on your screen on the right is the highest ranked catchments, so the top 20% for all of the projected habitats. So for the the more land cover-based terrestrial habitats, which are in a bluish gray, and the purple illustrates the top 20% of catchments that have headwaters, rivers, and streams that are in the top 20%. Combined into a similar shade gives us a look at a draft blueprint. So for the U.S. portion of the Gulf Coast Prairie, what are the areas of the landscape that we feel are the highest ranked catchments for our broadly defined habitats? I'd note that the amount of area designated by this scenario is similar to footprints that other LCCs across the Southeast are looking to submit to CCAS as well. Zooming into the Texas Midcoast, so from west to east, from San Antonio to Beaumont, and really looking at where this blueprint shapes up, where this scenario shapes up. I'd like to point out that the dark bluish gray are the more land cover terrestrial habitat projections, and the red are the catchments that are ranked highest for the streams, rivers, and headwaters. So there are some overlap between areas that have catchments that have high value of broadly defined habitats in the terrestrial and aquatic, but there's also separation as well. Here in the center of the image are 9 counties where the Oaks and Prairie joint venture are focusing delivery of grassland restoration and habitat enhancement on private lands, otherwise known as their GRIP project or GRIP program. And you can see that quite a bit of those counties have been identified in our coarse filter as having, pretty high importance for both terrestrial and aquatic systems. This area also is of primary interest for the Gulf Coast joint venture as well. So huge stretches of the Gulf Coast have also been identified as having a diversity of habitat that's of high quality, or at least projected to be of high quality. Another part of our geography, looking at the same scenario where the blue is the more terrestrial or land cover-based projections, and the red are the more river-based catchments, or the aquatic catchments. And again, overlaying the Oaks and Prairie joint venture focus counties for grassland restoration and improvement on private lands. The last example of how this scenario is shaping up. Across the borders of Texas and Louisiana, Lake Calcasieu, Sabine River, Sabine Lake, there's quite a bit of catchments that have been identified as having high ranking for both terrestrial or land cover based and also the aquatics based. Now ultimately, I'll go back to this one. Ultimately, these coarse filter landscape conservation designs will help us bridge that planning to implementation, and will actually force us to further along in the planning process. As I said before, we've identified our focal species and habitats, but we have yet to date designate many habitat objectives, and few of our focal species have population objectives. It's a process like this that will help us circle back into those discussions to help us look at, how much and where we want to look at addressing habitat delivery to achieve population and habitat objectives. But also, these exercises will help us into identifying where we can engage in finer filter or more higher resolution conservation planning and design with partners. As I mentioned before, we're looking to submit, we are committed to submitting something to the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy Blueprint for fall. And so a couple slides I've taken from CCAS coordinator Cynthia Edwards here, just what the blueprint is and what it might do across the Southeast. So the CCAS blueprint would stitch together LCC efforts across the Southeast, looking at shared priorities for conservation and restoration across the entire Southeast. Like a construction blueprint, it's in the plan for making CCAS a reality. So helping us to identify where in the landscape across the Southeast we have priorities, built on the best available information to us that is iterative and so could be improved over time. It is primarily geared to help inform decision making. It doesn't make decisions, but it will will help those who seek to make decisions. And so far, there's hundreds of participants in putting these things together across the LCCs in the Southeast. It's primarily designed so that folks at state, federal agencies, or developers, planners, and other professionals could look at where locations are for smart urban growth, where stream restoration opportunities could occur, where we could focus to increase resilience, and where economic incentives achieve the best conservation outcomes on working lands. So there's a lot of different applications for this type of information. We're still in the process of putting it all together. Like I said, 5 other LCCs in the Southeast are committed to submitting a conservation blueprint to the CCATS for fall release. So the Appalachian LCC, Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks, South Atlantic, Peninsular Florida, and Caribbean LCCs all have their own independent planning and design efforts underway. Some are very, very much more sophisticated than we are in the Gulf Coast Prairie. And so it spans a continuum of sophistication and timeline. Some of these designs have gone back several years and had much more significant involvement from partners. So we're in the process of we're coordinating across our borders, looking at trying to make it as seamless as possible, and under a tight timeline of October, getting everything pulled together as a first iteration. To our end, we're committed to submitting something, and what I've provided today is a draft version 0.1, or the Strawman Scenario. To date, we haven't had anything really solid to look at, and so looking at where these catchments that are the highest 20% rank among all broadly defined habitats that we've projected, it gives us a place to start, and I'm hopeful we'll get some feedback from folks on the phone here, but also other members of the LCC partnership as we work towards getting that submission done. Like I mentioned a few minutes ago, this type of effort will enable us to initiate fine filter landscape conservation design efforts across our LCC. And so we've had a historic primary focus on coastal Texas to the Edwards Plateau, particularly Balcones. And this will continue to be our primary focus for engaging partners in more finer filter landscape conservation design. But I'd also like to note there are emerging opportunities to engage with our partners in other areas of the LCC geography, primarily the Red River, between Oklahoma and Texas, and also along the Chenier Plain in Louisiana and Texas. There's 2 areas that I highlighted before as well. Then ultimately, these more finer filter efforts or higher resolution, smaller scale efforts will help complete the bridge between planning and delivery with stronger ties to informing implementation to achieve conservation objectives. And with that, I'm going to open it up for some quick feedback and possible discussion on first thoughts as far as how our projections have shaped up, and get some reaction on thoughts are as far as the look of the blueprint as it stands right now. If you're on mute, please take yourself off mute if you're trying to talk. Jim? Hey, Jim, you still on the line?
I am.
Jim, what are your thoughts here?
I'm seeing the blackland totally left out, the blackland prairie, which is that white space down the middle.
Yep.
Is that because we haven't gotten to the agricultural model?
Yes, primarily agricultural lands have been dealt as a threat to most of the other broadly defined habitats. And so a natural result of that is the omission of those agricultural areas. It's been a challenge, but I think we have opportunities to get at that. The other confounding thing, as well, is in that same geography, along the I-35 corridor between San Antonio and Dallas-Fort Worth, we've dealt with urban land as a threat as well, and so a lot of the catchments between San Antonio and Dallas-Fort Worth are also lower ranked. It's not to say that there isn't some good quality habitat in there. It's just if you rank the top 20% across the entire LCC, those areas just really don't pop out that well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm just looking at the tallgrass prairie map, which makes, the blackland pretty dark, and then thinking about the monarch conservation strategy, which is the I-35 corridor. So somehow incorporating the agricultural lands, the tallgrass prairie, and that interest in the monarch conservation would change that white area to something more interesting. That's a big sub-eco region to leave out.
This is Bill Bardish. I was looking at it when I looked at that. What first jumped out to me, it was primarily urban and fragmentation issues that eliminated, the ability to find that top 20%. And it is primarily blackland, but there are some blackland areas that don't fit that as well. Whether it's a reduction in agriculture in that area or whether it's urbanization, I'm not sure. I think that's definitely got some implications to what we do, especially based on last month's webinar where we talked about trying to find ways to delve into this urban landscape design in a meaningful way. How do we look at this fairly large piece of the landscape and decide, do we work there for conservation or do we avoid it? Good questions to bring up.
So another thing that I mentioned early on in my talk is that this is an independent design effort where we're not promoting or haven't include any of the areas identified as conservation opportunity areas in Oklahoma or Texas or Louisiana. And if we are interested in incorporating information like that into this blueprint for submission to CCAS, then we need to get some feedback on that. As it stands right now, it's a completely independent set of data projections for these habitats, and from my perspective, it might benefit by looking at where the potential overlaps in those conservation opportunity areas that have been thoroughly vetted within our partners.
This is Matt Wagner. Can y'all hear me?
Yes, sir.
You talked about agriculture lands, and remind me again what's included in that. Is that mostly farmlands, or does it include hay, pastures?
That should be row crops.
It's row crop, okay. I mean, I think, you know, maybe the next step or a step down the road would be to certainly include those agricultural lands, you know, for potential restoration as we see the, you know, commodity prices fluctuate and recreational lands becoming more valuable. There's certainly a lot of restoration potential there. I think that is a missing ingredient, would be very important over time.
Okay. Matt, do you see anything else here that is a showstopper or touching on nerves for you?
No, I think, you know, you've done a good job of laying it out with the broadly defined habitats, and, you know, being able to scale in and look more closely at the county level where there might be existing initiatives. You mentioned GRIP. Then there's a lot of other conservation initiatives going on out there, and we can see some overlap. But this is the coarse scale, and then the fine scale will follow at some point. But before you embark on the fine scale, are y'all planning to roll this out in October as part of the CECAS presentation, or at the Southeastern?
Yeah, so good question, Matt. So essentially, this being a straw man right now, looking at getting the review and feedback from the steering committee, you all, and make any sort of revisions as needed if we need to incorporate any of those conservation opportunity areas in some way. We certainly have that at our disposal. And working across borders with Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks, looking at integrating some of those habitats, primarily aquatic habitats, just try to make it a little bit more seamless rather than switching gears at the border, and getting it ready by the end of August as a placeholder eventually, so that we have a few weeks as all clear before it gets rolled out. So if I go back to this Texas, I'll call it Texas coast, Houston to Corpus Christi, I note that there's some folks from the refuge system on the line today, and just want to reiterate our interest in the GCP as our primary focus for more finer filter landscape conservation design efforts is couched within this Balcones to the Gulf, or hill country to the Gulf. And to date, we haven't had these projections until very recently that will help shape our contribution to those types of efforts. And so knowing that the Outwater Prairie Chicken Refuge have an interest around the refuge, but also in two counties further south, Refuge and Goliad, that's linked together with the 9 GRIP delivery counties from the Oaks and Prairie Joint Venture. Products like this will help shape our engagement in those efforts, try to get at those finer filter landscape conservation designs. I think gives us a good place to start, and would see if anyone from that geography has any feedback on what you might see on your screen. This truly is a straw man, so we all have thick skin here. So if there's any showstoppers or things that just don't look right, I'd invite you to speak up. All right, I'm going to pick on Jim one more time. Jen Giacomo, do you have any thoughts on how these projections shape up with the delivery counties you all work with or work in?
Yeah, well, from the bird monitoring standpoint, from, you know, what we're picking up with 14 different priority species, Washington County, which is the northmost little county that kind of lays horizontal, is the one that is more forested and not getting a lot of grasslands. But down in Colorado and Austin counties, which are the bigger ones with lots of purple and lots of red in the middle there, those are the ones that we get, yeah, right there. Those are the ones where we're getting a lot of quail, and that's where the refuge is. So that's driving a lot of what we're thinking about. I was going to ask you to point out, you pointed out the Colorado River runs through this area, but the Chenier Plain and the northern, the Red River area, wondering if you could point those out too as kind of areas.
So the Red River runs here, and Oaks and Prairie Joint Venture is delivering grassland restoration in the counties, shaded in gray. There's a good aggregation of catchments, both on terrestrial and more aquatic base projections in this geography, and connecting. A lot of these are larger bodies of water reservoirs, which we haven't included yet in our projections. So really the gap in the I-35 corridor primarily stops, you know, nearly the Red River in Texas. So you get these huge gaps in larger, in catchments that are ranked high, I guess. But once you get into Oklahoma, there seems to be, you know, very significant aggregation of these high-ranked catchments.
Yeah, at the Red River, you cross out of Blackland and into Cross Timbers.
Yeah.
Ben, this is Steve DeMasso.
Morning, Steve.
You made some comments about trying to match up seamlessly with the GCP LCC to the east.
Yep.
Are those same efforts being made to match up seamlessly with the Great Plains out to the west, LCC?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's sort of a conundrum for us because, you know, the way that the GCPO and the Great Plains have approached landscape conservation design, they're frankly very, very different. And we're still in discussions on how we can integrate both east and west. I really don't have a good answer for you right now, Steve. I think it's going to be a challenge for us. I think the way that I would like to tackle it is integrate more on the aquatic side with the GCPO to the east, and with more of the land cover-based projections to the west.
You know, I just going back to that Red River slide, there's also, it's more than just black land, because there's obviously black land, at least on the Fort Worth Prairie, that's showing up as a fair amount of quality catchments. If you go due north of Fort Worth, that's been broken up quite a bit with some of the Barnett Shale, but then there is a fair amount of agriculture up there, and it is black land. It's just not the same as that deep black land to the east of Dallas. But what I'm seeing from Dallas north to the Exoma is not so much agriculture, it's city. What I'm seeing from Dallas to Louisville and Denton, straight north on that map, there's still some units in there, but most of that's city. It's not the geology and surface soils that are driving that. And that's a question we need to tease out, because that's really a good point of discussion right there.
Yeah, so to that end, because we've dealt with developed land as a threat to habitats, what we're essentially saying is that we're not really interested in doing any conservation in large cities, which, for what it's worth, is what it is. We haven't, as an LCC, really focused so much to date on habitats or focal species in those more urban cores. But I think that there are potential opportunities, as Jim Giacomo mentioned, to engage the Fish and Wildlife Service with and others like Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation, in efforts to enhance or restore smaller scale habitats for things like monarch butterfly or other pollinators in those more urban cores, especially along the I-35 corridor. So, but as we treated it now, those urban areas really are blank spaces on the map.
Hey, Ben, this is Jim. One more question. On your big map of the whole LCC, the Tamaulipan brushland comes up as a big purple blob,
Yep.
The U.S. portion of it. Is there any reason why the model doesn't differentiate that down, or why it's picking such a big area, and is there any reason to expect that it would extend into Mexico like that?
Yeah, so since this is the top 20% catchments, it's pulling on a few different things. One, it's pulling on the semi-desert shrub grassland primarily, but also some of the floodplain headwaters and streams. So because it has so little developed land or impervious land, because those are pretty high sinuosity and have a low risk for degradation, those products combined are really driving that. But primarily it's the shrubland, grassland. All right, well, I've got 45 after, a little after that. So if no one else has any other questions, I'm going to thank you for calling in. This is our Strawman version 0.1 coarse filter, landscape conservation design for the Gulf Coast Prairie. And we'll continue to work within our science team and steering committees to translate this into something we can submit to CCAS, but also help us to engage our partners in more finer filter efforts across our geography, and at the same time help us further our efforts to determine our biological objectives for habitats and focal species so that we can ultimately achieve our mission and our vision for our partnership. So with that, I want to thank you all, and next month on Wednesday, August 3rd, our next presentation will be Drs. Dana Infante and Dana Wesley Daniel from Michigan State University, and they'll present final results of a LCC-funded project that looks at freshwater mussel ecology, biology literature, and pulling a spatially explicit product together for us with which, so more of a foundational data product with which a range-wide conservation plan could be based across the GCP. So the news of that's on our website, and if you all have any interest in freshwater mussels, I invite you to come back next month, Wednesday, August 3rd. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.